Welcome to leveraging the ecosystem for enhanced security. I thought that it was interesting, we had the title leveraging, or the word leveraging in a lot of the titles for a number of different sessions here, and so I thought maybe we should have just shortened it to using the ecosystem for enhanced security. Or the other pitch that I had was calling this "My enemies' enemies are my friends," which I thought also might be fairly fitting. So things we're going to talk about today, just give you kind of a high-level overview of the evolving mobile threat landscape. Talk a little bit about protecting the campus network when it comes to mobile devices. Then talk about managing device and app vulnerabilities, and then spend a little time on wrap-up and Q&A. So for those of you that don't know me, my name is James Plouffe. I'm a lead solutions architect with the Service Connect ecosystem team. So most of my time is spent working with our ecosystem partners who interface specifically through the MobileIron platform APIs. So less the device stuff, more the server-side integrations, and primarily the infrastructure and security technologies. I've been in IT networking and security for a little over 15 years, and for those of you that have been around MobileIron a little while, you may know that it is a tradition when you introduce yourself at MobileIron, you're supposed to list some kind of fun fact about yourself. So I actually have put 4 fun facts up here, 3 of which are true, and 1 of which is not. And so even if none of the rest of this is interesting, you'll have something to contemplate, and we'll come back to this at the end. It's also my seed for the Q&A portion of the program, so keep those in mind as we go through the rest of this. When we talk about what the ecosystem does, you may have seen MobileIron talking recently about the way that we're kind of dividing our solutions into things like mobile access control and looking at secure app deployment, secure BYOD, secure fleet management, and then kind of separate from the solutions themselves is this question of compliance, which underpins a lot of things, but is not necessarily a solution in itself. The things that we'll be focusing on here are actually the 2 boxes on the left, primarily mobile access control, and then securing things in the mobile fleets and securing applications. So with that, we'll dig right into the mobile threat landscape. I am not as much of an alarmist as this guy, but it seems like we have a little bit of a security advantage right now that we might be squandering. And so even though I don't think it's all doom and gloom, I think we probably have a few steps that we need to take to protect ourselves a little better. So last year, for anyone who missed it, was a big year for mobile vulnerabilities. We saw a lot of stuff happen, whether that was KeyRaider that compromised over 200,000 iTunes accounts in 18 different countries, or Stagefright, which affected almost 1 billion Android devices and could be targeted or directed at users with something as simple as a telephone number. Xcode Ghost and YSpectre, which were the first instances of iOS malware that targeted non-jailbroken devices, or simple things like CVE 2016-0728, which you may not know the number, but what it amounts to is a Linux kernel vulnerability that affected lots of things, including Android. So if you want a deeper dive on what some of these things were and how they worked, and some of the other more terrifying things, I will be back on this stage tomorrow afternoon talking about that. And I will entice you further by saying I am talking about all those things in the context of Harry Potter characters. So it should be fascinating. If nothing else, you'll want to see how those metaphors play out, right? So here's a chart of the critical vulnerabilities and exposures for Apple iOS and Google Android. I didn't put this chart up here to spark any kind of a debate about which operating system is actually more secure. I don't necessarily think that CVEs are the best standalone measure of that. But what I want to point out by putting this up here is that the trend line is moving the wrong direction. So you can see in 2007, 2008, 2009, those are the years when the iPhone launched and the first Android phones started to ship. It was very, very flat, and so that probably wasn't all that bad, but you can see as the operating systems have matured, the increase in CVEs has spiked dramatically. So the short version is that mobile security is getting a little bit more prickly. And I'd just like to use this image because how great is that? So with that, I'd like to move on to protecting the campus network. And that in the context of mobile access control, when we look at the ecosystem, what we usually mean is network access control or NAC. I realize that most of you in the audience are probably not the network administrators at your organizations, but maybe this will give you some framework to extend an olive branch to those guys and help maybe work a little bit better. As a recovering network guy, I used to hate it when the mobility people showed up at my desk with a request, but hopefully some of the things we'll share with you here can help, bridge that gap a little bit. So, once upon a time, before BYOD was the acronym du jour, the network guys had a different name for devices that people brought in themselves. These are some visual clues. I'm hoping there's at least one comic book nerd in the audience who knows what we're talking about here. Rogues, rogue endpoints. And when you look at network systems, actually, let me back up. There is a joke that has kind of a questionable setup in which a few folks are talking about the greatest technological advancements of all time. And the first guy says, well, I think the greatest technological advancement is the space program because it allowed humans to leave the planet for the first time. It was like the first step to exploring the broader universe, and all of these amazing ancillary technologies came out of the space program. And the second guy says, well, all right, that's probably fair, but do you think we could have done any of that stuff without electricity? Fair point. The third guy says, I think that the greatest technological advancement is the thermos. And the first two guys rather skeptically say, why on earth do you think that? And the third guy says, well, it's very simple, right? A thermos keeps hot stuff hot and cold stuff cold. How does it know how to do that? And so if you think about the way networks usually work, they're not unlike that thermos. They're perfectly capable of doing their jobs without actually knowing very much about what's going on inside them. From a security context, though, that gets a little dicey, right? So there's the big punchline. And so if we look at how network access control works without MobileIron, it can see the device and it can authenticate that device, whether that's through user credentials or device credentials, and it can assign access. Most modern network access control systems include some kind of a device profiler, so they have some sense of what type of device is accessing the network, but it's effectively a black box. So, here's a screenshot from our partners over at Aruba who are just there from their ClearPass product, showing that using the device profiler, they figured out that 8% of the devices on the network are smart devices. So using the device profiler actually lets you start to ask some important questions about those devices. The first is, how many are actually on your network? Most people who spend any time checking this out are surprised to find that they actually have a lot more network endpoints on their network than they thought they did. The second important question is, what types of network endpoints are they? So most network guys are often shocked to learn that the profiles of the devices that they're seeing are radically different than they expected, especially in the context of mobile devices when they mostly expected to see a lot of laptops. And the third important question it can help you ask is, do you know enough about what's going on with those devices to grant them the level of access they currently have? So based on what I know about this device, should it be doing the stuff it's doing? So let's take a look at MobileIron without network access control. You know very well from your experience with us that we can configure settings, we can provision credentials, we can monitor the posture of those devices, but MobileIron is not itself an authentication server. And so while tools like Selective Wipe may give you some flexibility in restricting access to network resources, they're not going to give you the same level of granularity that, for example, a network admission control system might. But when you put it all together, you provide the capability of MobileIron to share posture information with the network admission control system, which is effectively the gatekeeper to the campus network. And now you can start to make more intelligent decisions based on what's actually happening on that device and grant or restrict access accordingly. The other thing that is very important about integrating these two systems is that EMM integration improves the endpoint profiler accuracy. So the good news is that most endpoint profilers in modern network access control systems are pretty accurate, but they are sort of triangulating what the devices are based on a number of different attributes, whether that's radius requests or DHCP requests, or even looking at web browser user agent strings. So at the end of the day, what you're dealing with is effectively an educated guess. It's usually a pretty solid one, but it's still a guess. And so when you tie in what MobileIron can provide to the network access control system, you go from a very well-educated guess to 100% certainty on exactly what the devices are. So this is just a screenshot kind of highlighting how the devices themselves appear in an endpoint database. You can see we've got a little bit of cursory information here. If we dive a little bit deeper, you can start to drill down on the different attributes that are available, so you can make differentiated access decisions on things like whether, that's not the right one, give me the laser. Whether or not the device has encryption enabled, whether MDM is enabled. Another big differentiator that we see is folks wanting to provide different levels of network access based on the device ownership. So if it's a BYO device, I want to grant access to a certain set of resources. If it's a corporate liable device, I want to make a different decision about that. And this type of integration helps you accomplish that. For those of you that are familiar with Sentry, it's very much kind of the same idea, but for your campus Wi-Fi instead of for devices that live outside the network. This is just a second screenshot showing a couple more. It's got the app blacklisting list there. So again, a lot of attributes that you can toggle to decide what the right level of access for your devices is. So a couple of caveats about integrating network admission control with the MobileIron servers. So there's currently no mechanism for us to notify NAC platforms. It's something that we're talking a lot about, thinking about, and planning to address, but most operations today are polling, so the NAC system will poll MobileIron to get information. Depending on which NAC platform your organization might be using, the behavior varies, so happy to answer any questions about that if you know what you're using and wonder how it works. Query intervals and radius change of authorization behavior varies between NAC platforms. So for those of you not intimately familiar with radius, radius is an authentication protocol, and it has this nifty thing called change of authorization, or COA, that lets it send a message to network access devices to say, make this network client have a different set of access procedures. But the behavior of different NAC platforms varies depending on when they pull MobileIron for information and when they get it back. The other thing to be aware of is that different mobile OSs handle Wi-Fi session reauthentication differently. And so one of the things to be aware of is that if you set aggressive reauth timers, Android in particular will have a little bit of a nutty because its network connectivity gets interrupted very frequently. So while people want very, very real-time information, the reality is that in practical terms that can be difficult to achieve. So moving on to device and app vulnerabilities. One of the things that we've been dealing with, of course, with MobileIron, we have the ability to deploy and configure apps, whether we're dealing with native OS frameworks or things like App Connect. We have a lot of interesting technologies to secure those applications. But what happens if some of the applications we're not responsible for turn out to be malicious? It turns out that there are folks out there who are working to solve this problem, where they're looking at things like what sorts of permissions the applications are requesting, what their behaviors are, both from a static and dynamic level, so looking at whether things are hard-coded into the app, like usernames, passwords, things of that sort. When the apps are run, are they exfiltrating data to unexpected locations, that sort of thing. The great news is they have a lot of data. Without tying in the app inventory, it doesn't turn out to be particularly actionable. And of course, once we tie in and integrate the app inventory data, then they can pass threat intelligence back to us, and we're in a position to enforce policy on that device if it in fact has risky devices. So here's an example of how a report might look from one of our partners, App Authority, who is just over there. I encourage you to visit and talk with them and all of our security partners. That shows sort of the breakdown of different risk profiles that they observed in one organization. So you can see there's interesting things like malware, data exfiltration. One of my favorite things to talk about is actually the one on the end, the dead or zombie apps. So as many of you are probably aware, the commercial app stores go to great lengths to keep malware out of their environments, and if something happens to sneak by, they generally remove that application in a pretty timely fashion. And even though the app stores actually have the ability to remove those apps from mobile devices, they generally don't do that. And so an interesting sidebar is that if apps got installed on mobile devices, that malware can live on even though the app has been removed from the commercial app store. So you've addressed that new installation problem, but you still have sort of a lingering threat there. Another mobile threat example, looking at, this example is actually from Skycure, so this is reporting more on the device level threats, looking at vulnerabilities. This is kind of a different approach, taking a look at vulnerabilities that may be related to operating systems, as well as looking at interesting or malicious behavior from things like public hotspots. So here's an example of how that kind of plays out. You can see here's a bunch of different networks. Here's one of our sales reps' phones, and he is actually notorious for heading to places that have sketchy Wi-Fi connectivity. So this is just a quick list of all of our app reputation and mobile threat partners that are here. They're lined up back here in the sponsor zone, so I encourage you to please stop by and talk to them, hear what they have to say. They're all doing some very interesting stuff. And so I feel like I maybe really blasted through that presentation, but if you have any questions, I'm happy to take them now. If you can do me a favor and head for the microphone, we're trying to record it for posterity, so. John has a question.
Could you speak to the value of authentication between device and user within the validation of the user against all devices and the role that plays and integration with MobileIron?
So are we talking here about authenticating individually a user and authenticating separately a device, or authenticating a user on a device?
Both, but I also saw in your deck it talking down at you saying that the gain on authentication had to be controlled, that you don't want to screw up the enterprise by having over-authentication in movement between access points and applications and the like. And I apologize because my audio cut out so I could only see it, not hear it.
So I think in that context, when I said gatekeeper, I was referring less to gating authentications and more to authentication servers being the gatekeeper. So John happens to work for Aruba, and I think his interest in this is, I think if I'm hearing you correctly, your concern was that we were saying you need to authenticate less, and I would actually submit to you that is not what I am suggesting at all. That, yeah, authentication is critically important. So I would argue that in fact you need to authenticate users, and you do also need to authenticate devices, and I would argue further that authenticating user agents becomes equally important, particularly as you look at how apps interact, right? One of my sort of favorite mischievous user agents is something called GoodReader for iPad. Do you guys know this app? It's really cool, right? It's great for looking at PDFs. It also includes SCP, FTP, CIFS, and other interesting file transfer capabilities. So that is a great tool if you hold it right, and if you hold it wrong, it becomes sort of a weird weapon. And so I think understanding exactly what the state of everything that accesses your network is important to completing a holistic security picture. Good? All right, he's given me the okay, so, and he's fairly picky, so if he's satisfied, I'm gonna leave it at that. Anyone else? Oh man.
So, walk me. Oh, so normally I have to be like back at the end of the room because my voice is too loud.
Normally.
So when I talk to a lot of customers about this, there's often sort of the, I use certs. So certs can give me rudimentary ways of saying you can't get on my network unless you have the certificate, and I can revoke the cert. So what's the incremental benefit of saying going the NAC-based approach versus using certs as a way to do access control?
I think certs can be very useful from a user experience perspective. Certainly they do away with some of the pain of things like password management and other things like that. What certs don't necessarily do for you automatically is give you visibility into what the state of a device is. And so the presence of the certificate, depending on how you're managing the life cycle of it, may tell you a little bit about the device, but that by itself I don't think is going to be an adequate indicator of what the overall security state of that device is. Why other MobileIron employees trying to ask me tricky questions? That hardly seems fair. Anyone else? All right, well, I'll hang out for a little bit if you want to come up and talk. As I said, we'll be doing a deeper dive on the mobile threats, the mobile threat landscape tomorrow in Defense Against the Dark Apps. We're also doing the Customer Security Forum live, so you can bring more questions and that sort of thing. We'd love to understand kind of the things that you guys are grappling with out in the wide, wide world, and thank you all for attending.